Welcome, everyone. I'm Anthony Chase. I'm professor of diplomacy and world affairs here at Occidental College and also chair of the Young Initiative on Global Political Economy. So I'm honored to welcome you all, and particularly honored to welcome Mayor Eric Garcetti to Occidental, his old home, to mark what has been a remarkable element in his term as LA's mayor, the manner in which he has put forth front and center the idea of Los Angeles as a global city, a quasi city-state, if you will, empowered by the city's uniquely transnational populations to be a center of global art, global commerce, and global politics. So before getting to the mayor's discussion of all that, I just want to highlight one important way in which this openness to the globe has manifested itself here at Occidental College. That's the way in which, under Mayor Garcetti's leadership, LA's International Affairs Department has worked with us to advance city academic research partnerships on how global norms can inform local policy. This has included research partnerships via the Young Initiative with Oxy faculty and students in many departments, ranging from at the start of the alphabet, biology, to the end of the alphabet, or our alphabet, urban and environmental policy. Let me just give one example. This semester, DBA professor Madeline Baer is helping lead a research project for recommendations to the mayor's office to advance menstrual health and equity at the city level, drawing from initiatives from around the globe, cities around the world, such as Nairobi, Kenya, Medellin, Colombia, and Seoul, in terms of how to advance menstrual justice. So thank you to Mayor Garcetti for the leadership in making possible these mutually beneficial joint research projects. And now I'll turn it over to someone else in LA's mayor's office who has also been a wonderful partner, this on a joint project around addressing racial injustice in Los Angeles via a potential truth and accountability process. Deputy Mayor, and of course, Occidental grad, Brenda Shockley, to whom I will now pass the baton. Brenda.
Thank you, Anthony. It's been such a pleasure to work with you and to return to work with Occidental after all these years. I'm particularly honored as an Oxy grad to introduce President Harry Elam, who actually has been here since 2020, so needs little introduction. But what I am proud to say is that in 16 days, he will be inaugurated as the 16th president of Occidental College. Dr. Elam.
Thank you, Brenda. I didn't realize it was 16 days, but that's great to hear. It is my pleasure to introduce our mayor. Eric Garcetti is a fourth-generation Angelino and the 42nd mayor of Los Angeles, the son of public servants and the grandson and great-grandson of immigrants from Mexico and Eastern Europe. Mayor Garcetti's life has been shaped by a deep commitment to the core values of justice, dignity, and equality for all people. The mayor's government service began on the LA City Council, where he spent 4 terms as council president before being elected mayor in 2013 and winning re-election in 2017 by the largest margin in the history of Los Angeles. Beyond his time at City Hall, Mayor Garcetti has served his country as an intelligence officer in the United States Navy Reserve and taught at the University of Southern California and here at Occidental College. The mayor received his BA and MA from Columbia University and studied as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University and later at the London School of Economics. He is also a jazz pianist and photographer. He and his wife, First Lady Amy Elaine Wakeland, are the proud parents of a daughter, Maya, and have been foster parents for more than a decade. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Thank you so much, President Elam. What a joy it is to be with you and Professor Chase, the extraordinary partnership that we've had, and to be back home at Occidental with work that's led, among others, by Brenda Shockley, an extraordinary Tiger alum and a joy to work with and a powerful force for equity and justice in our city. So thank you to all 3 of you and to the Oxy community, from which I came to City Hall. I was thinking this morning driving in, my last office outside of City Hall was at Occidental College. So some 2 decades later, I still think of it as my last job and a place that still fills me with such amazing memories. And I'm glad that they're not just memories, but we're making new history together. And congratulations on your appointment again. 16 days, don't be stressed. You're going to be great. And I know that in COVID time, even though it's been almost 2 years since you've been appointed, it really probably feels like yesterday. So I look forward to three-dimensional interactions with you. I was last at Oxy in 2019 when I was asked, had the honor of giving the commencement address and received an honorary doctorate from Occidental, one of the greatest honors of my life and one of the most joyous days of my time in City Hall. So congratulations, and the college is very lucky to have your leadership and vision, your record, and your values, because the talents are okay, values are better. And to be able to bring the incredible board, staff, students, faculty together is no easy task, but I wish you nothing but the very best. And Occidental in so many ways shaped my own life. It was my gateway to local politics. I was a professor both of diplomacy and world affairs and in politics when the Democratic National Convention came in 2000, and we held a parallel youth convention with all LAUSD schools represented. In 2000, 2001, my wife worked at UEPI, putting together with my longtime chief of staff, Ana Guerrero, who they met there, an agenda with Professors Dreyer and a couple others on a progressive agenda for the 2001 mayor's race that Jim Hahn and Antonio Villaraigosa, now Secretary Javier Becerra and others ran for. So this has been a really important through line in my life, but I've also seen the impact that Occidental makes in the global world. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit here today. When we looked at the work that Occidental could do, and I think a lot of people wondered when I was a professor why I was running for city council. People said, you're a professor of diplomacy and world affairs. You've been interested in human rights work and international development, gender equity. Why are you running for city council? It's so local when you're such a global person. And to me, I said, have you looked around Los Angeles lately? This is the most global city on the face of the earth, and local politics is global. Vice versa, global politics means nothing if we aren't rooted in local communities, one street and neighborhood, one city and community at a time. That's where we see gender equity, peace, human rights, security, the issues that we grapple with all happen for a person in her neck of the woods, in the place where individuals live. And here where we have historic Filipino town and little Bangladesh, little Tokyo and little Armenia, we see this city is filled with the face of the world on the streets of LA. But I also found the opposite to be true. As a representative of the city, when I left LA growing up here, I saw the face of LA on the streets of the world in the same manner. In other words, I can be comfortable in Mexico City, I can be comfortable in Tokyo, in Cairo, in London, in any place on the face of the earth because it looks like LA. And in 2013, when voters handed me the reins of this city and asked me to be the chief executive officer of LA, it was one of the most international cities of the world, with some of the largest diaspora communities anywhere, with deep and cultural and business ties, trade, tourism, investment from around the globe. But we also are an exporter of this country through Hollywood, through the brilliance and creativity of our universities and colleges, of our aerospace industry, and so much more. In many ways, the whole world knows LA before they get here, and vice versa. So Occidental has very much been a springboard to the path that I've traveled, and it's set me up for serving LA both locally and internationally as your mayor. And it's played a big role in recent work that we've done. That's not just history, it's the present as well, especially in realizing our Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, right here in LA. You see, LA was one of the first cities in the world to measure and to report on to the United Nations our progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. This move towards localization of the implementation of these goals is critical, because national governments can collect these statistics, but if local governments aren't working to achieve those benchmarks, those reports will be pretty bad. And I'm so grateful, for more than 50 students from Occidental who have really been the fuel behind this effort, including Caroline Diamond and Alejo Magini, who we're going to hear from, and I'm looking forward to your moderated questions as well. So Oxy students have worked on everything from mapping the fossil fuel supply chain in our city to researching restorative justice and truth-telling in our history of racial inequity. You've proposed ways of supporting students who are facing housing insecurity and so much more. In other words, you've helped to make LA a more livable, equitable, and just place, and deepened our vision of what the city of the future should look like. And you've articulated a common language which we can use to achieve those goals, to show the world a model of accountability, both locally and globally, a way to take action. So global engagement and equity and service, these are the values that I've always seen at the core of Occidental's mission, but they're also at the core of who we are, the City of Angels. And when people ask me to define what LA stands for, I always say freedom, I always say creativity, and I always say belonging. The freedom speaks for itself, this horizontal city, this place that John F. Kennedy talked about when he was accepting nomination to be president here in LA at the Coliseum and gave that famous New Frontier speech. He talked about LA and the West Coast as the last frontier, a place we came to find freedom, to reinvent ourselves. Mix that with the creativity that has defined what LA is about, from Hollywood to the art scene to everything in between. But the third and most powerful of those three to me is belonging. It's better than talking about diversity or inclusion. Diversity could be anything. Inclusion implies somebody has more power and is deigning to include you. But belonging makes us all equal, gives us ownership, and touches us emotionally about why we belong in a place. And so when we launched our collaboration of SDGs back in 2018, it was a very different time. And it was also a very different administration in Washington, one in which belonging was not the value. Exclusion was what we increasingly saw coming out of the mouths of our leaders nationally. We had moves to disengage from the world, to withdraw from American leadership, to ban people on their religion from coming inside the United States, and to act with real hostility towards what I believe are the core American values. Let's just say it was a stressful 4 years for many of us. And then came a violent insurrection, a global pandemic, the worst economic downturn that we've ever seen, a righteous march for racial justice. And the world then suddenly saw in recent months the invasion of a sovereign country by Russia in Ukraine. And it feels all of a sudden like this is a much more dangerous place, a much more divided place, split over ideology and culture and technology. But here's the thing before you get too depressed or you feel too powerless. When things seem the darkest, that's when we find our power. That's when we have to work to bring back the light. Because these things never have come easy in human history, but they do come when we focus, when we're tested, and when we exercise the power that we have. Maybe you felt like this has been incredibly tough years. You're carrying the trauma, certainly I am, of watching so many of my neighbors die from COVID, of businesses get shut down, of what we saw in Minneapolis with George Floyd dying. Those traumas we carry in us every single day. One of my first Zoom calls, though, tapped into this global network that we've built to help save the lives of local residents. See, I chaired C40, a group of the 100 or so biggest cities on the globe, in our work on climate change. We represent a quarter of the world's GDP. All of our work on climate change together is about the size of the fourth or fifth biggest emitter in the world. It's a powerful network of men and women who are mayors around the world, who had came together at the beginning on a Zoom call, probably my second Zoom ever, when I hit the bat signal, and suddenly about 50 of those 100 mayors were on the phone, on the Zoom, talking about this new coronavirus. We heard from the mayor of Seoul about what drive-through testing was before anybody knew what that meant. The mayor of Milan, when North Italy was the hotspot, about how to prepare your hospitals and the hallways so that fewer people would die when your hospitals were overwhelmed. And that collaboration, those things we learned, we started implementing the next day. We didn't have to work them through national committees. We didn't have to present them to prime ministers and presidents who then spent weeks negotiating with each other about action. We did it the next day. And that collaboration collectively saved millions of lives. Indeed, here in LA, I'm convinced that call saved tens of thousands of Angelenos, because we became the first place to have those drive-through testing, the largest testing centers in the world, the first place to shut down, the first place to mandate masks, the first place to start testing people who didn't have symptoms when people thought that was crazy. We went into our skilled nursing facilities and mandated those tests for workers and for the most vulnerable seniors who were dying. We took the racial gap where Black Americans were dying at twice the rate of their represented population and brought that down to under the represented percentage of Black Angelenos here in LA. And so that global information sharing and partnership can address some of the toughest challenges, whether it's a pandemic you don't expect to happen or a climate change crisis that we can see every single day. When I was in November at the Glasgow COP summit, I was asked as one of only 3 people who was not a national leader to join the stage of national leaders in the first 2 days by the UN to present a pledge, not just of the 100 cities or so of C40, but 1,049 cities that we organized over a year who promised to go carbon neutral. And as I said, that pledge was as big as the 4th to 5th largest country in the world. And we said, we are not only doing it, going to do it, we are already doing it. In fact, of the 97 cities of C40, 2/3 of them are ahead of their promises from Paris, whereas there's only one nation that has met that timeline globally, the Gambia, a very small nation in West Africa. So we don't say that to shame national governments. We say that to inspire them, that if cities can do it, where we have to build buildings, where we have to bring electricity, where we have to have transportation networks, you sure as heck can do it at the national level too. Los Angeles is also a member of 100 resilient cities, which helped us proactively before an earthquake and looking at climate change, look at resilience in a holistic way to strengthen our buildings so that people don't die when the next big one hits, to put for the first time a resilient city plan together that was lauded as the best in the world. And I helped to co-found the Mayor's Migration Council, looking at how we can help migrants globally and be able to incorporate them as strong citizens across the globe into our cities and our nations. And we also founded Change, which is the first international city-led network on gender equity, which I co-founded with the mayors of London and Mexico City, Tokyo, and Sierra Leone, Freetown, and represents 50 million people already across 5 continents. And I mention this not as a brag sheet. This is work that we all did together, Occidental, my international affairs office, and Los Angeles, to reassure you that at a moment that feels so fraught globally, there are things happening to bring us together, even as we see forces tearing us apart. So I want to close my remarks today by talking about that future. I mentioned the work that we've done on SDGs, and I hope that Occidental will continue to be engaged and pressure my successor to continue this work. First and foremost, say, last mayor did it, this is a model, keep this going, no matter whom is elected. Because here's the thing about the SDGs, they are not some sort of abstract goals. They are very specific in improving the quality of life for Angelenos. They've helped us do things like raise the minimum wage in Los Angeles. And since I've been mayor, we've cut poverty by 27%. Black Angelenos earn 44%, Latinos earn 43% more than we started, way above the national averages of raising incomes in those communities. We became the largest city in America to make community college free and boosted by 40% the number of public school graduates going to college in just 2 years. When we make college free, things happen. And we committed to making DWP the country's largest municipal utility, 100% carbon free by 2035. And by the way, we'll be 97% of the way there at the end of this decade. When we started, we were 2% renewable. Recently, we went to the opening of the largest wind farm in America, which we helped get done in New Mexico, which will power us here. And we're at 61% carbon free, from 2% to 61%. So as my time as your mayor winds down, I think about what can I do to hand that warm baton off to the next generation of students, the next mayor, the next city council. And at the top of the list is to protect and to grow what we've built, because that is how our city will thrive. That's how we're going to be prepared for what's coming. In a few months in June, as I mentioned to a couple of the folks before we started, we're hosting the Summit of the Americas, the largest gathering of heads of state in LA's history. We're taking on this international role. For the second time, the US is hosting every head of state from Canada all the way down to Chile, and they'll be here in our city. We're expected to host the World Cup in 2026, hopefully the Women's World Cup in 2027, and of course, the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2028, when the world will literally be here. These are once in a generation moments to articulate who we are, to house our unhoused, to clean the air we breathe, to bring about full gender equity, to provide sports and athletic opportunities to all kids, no matter what their zip code is, to reduce our traffic and to build out our infrastructure, and to make sure we have economic prosperity and racial justice in our town in every single neighborhood. And I would tell our next mayor to stay as deeply engaged with the world, with the SDGs, and with Occidental College. In fact, bake that engagement into our DNA. Let me tell you, if you keep up the pressure so that LA maintains and deepens these global ties, we'll go from being a global city and a great global city to an indispensable global city. Now the 3rd largest municipal economy of any city in the world after Tokyo, and basically tied with New York. So I'll end with this, as I used to tell my students: don't cede the power you have before you try to exercise it. Know that you are powerful and don't be scared to use that. And don't wait. Be fearless, be humble, learn to listen and lead with love. And I can't wait to see what your leadership is going to do. When I'm no longer mayor and I have a more dangerous title, constituent and Angelino, I'll be expecting my government to continue that work and to deepen that work, and for Los Angeles to lead a world that is not split apart, but increasingly come together to fight for justice and equality for all. Thank you so much. I look forward to the questions.
Great, thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. Really appreciate that. And I just have to say, it's a cliche that the global is local and the local is global. But I think a lot of these initiatives you described show how that frame can actually make a powerful difference in the lives of people on the ground. So we'll definitely hope to as you suggest, pressure your successor to live up to that model in terms of our partnerships. As the mayor mentioned, our Q&A will be moderated by Caroline Diamond and Alejo Magini. And let me just briefly introduce them. Carolyn Diamond and Alejo Magini are both seniors here at Occidental College, be graduating in just about a month or so. They are DWA and Econ double majors. Alejo adds on to that a minor in education. Both are pure overachievers. And they've really, to the point, been integral in our research partnership with the City of LA, earning the trust of our city partners, not just as participants in our research task force, but actually leading some of those task force. So it's always a pleasure to work with them. And I love that they'll take the lead once again, this time in moderating our Q&A. Over to you, Caroline and Alejo.
Thank you, Professor Chase, and thank you, Mayor Garcetti, and thank you to all of our city officials who are joining today. Alejo and I have divided our audience questions into 3 sections. First, connecting the local and the global. 2, current challenges in Los Angeles. And finally, reflections from the mayor. Thank you to all of those who sent questions. And for any further questions, please use the Q&A function in the chat, and we'll get to those between each section. So as you mentioned, Mayor Garcetti, the localization of the UN Sustainable Development Goals seems to be one of the most important aspects of creativity in Los Angeles. So can you talk a little bit further about the ways in which LA's initiatives serve as a model for other cities to connect the global and the local, and in what areas LA would benefit from further cooperation?
Absolutely. One of the things that I love about being a mayor is that I don't have to just look within my country, but my relationships with mayors around the world allow me to look beyond the way we sometimes do things here in the United States. Take housing, for instance. It's clear that we need new models of housing in order to build enough housing after 4 decades of neglect to be able to not only house those who are unhoused, but you don't have to be unhoused to feel, you guys are graduating kind of like, well, could I afford to stay here? Is this the place that I want to lay my life down for the next 10 years or 20 years? Companies that leave, organizations that can't be here, and those that can't move are stuck here with the ultra wealthy and not a lot in between. So you look at places like Hong Kong or Singapore who have figured out public-private models. They're hyper-capitalist, but they have public housing that they've built together with the private sector to make sure that housing isn't just something you speculate on and win investments on, but that we actually look at it as a utility, like electricity and other things that human beings need, from healthcare to clean air. So some of those things that we can do with SDGs is to think beyond. Well, in America, public housing was done in the 50s and 60s, and we're not going to do any more of that. Well, thanks to our governor and thanks to this crisis, we were able to buy old motels and hotels, apartments that had been abandoned or that were just being built, and to convert those essentially into social housing that the government will own or nonprofits will own, that will help us get more people off of our streets. And I think the same thing is across those SDGs. It gives people locally kind of an international pressure to tell their local mayors, hey, in Buenos Aires, they're doing X, Y, and Z. Hey, in Auckland, they're doing ABC. In, Addis Ababa, there's something. And it also, I think, in many ways erodes that global north-south division, because I learned things from some of the lowest income country mayors, as well as the highest income country mayors. So just because you think you're coming from a rich country or a city and we've got all the answers, oftentimes, look at COVID in Africa right now. There's been much less of an impact because I think there's an infrastructure of public health workers and they're trusted. Whereas here, we never had that infrastructure, and all the misinformation, people don't even trust public health workers in this very dangerous way. So those are some of the ways SDGs can help pressure local elected officials, but also expand the ideas that they have and the ideas that they have to implement the action plans around these goals.
I'm going to pass it over to Alejo for audience questions.
Thank you, Mayor Garcetti. We have a question coming from Rick Cole discussing immigration. I will read it verbatim. It says, immigration is a controversial issue. What lessons did your service teach you about how best to integrate newcomers into an inclusive Los Angeles?
Well, Rick was part of that at the beginning of my administration as my first deputy mayor for budget and innovation. So great to have that question, and nice to see you, Rick. For me, immigrants are what LA is. 63% of our city are either immigrants or the children of immigrants. I think if you put grandchildren in there, we'd be 80 or 90%. And if you added migrants, meaning people who came from another part of the country, it's tough to find second and third generation Angelenos. I'm a third or fourth generation, but I feel sometimes like a unicorn. So if we're not addressing immigration and immigrants and migrants, we're not addressing our people. We're not representing LA. And in fact, the strength of our city has been everybody who's come here, from Iranian immigrants who came just before and after the revolution, who have invested in and grown our city, to the Mexican immigrants like my grandfather who came here as a baby when his father was killed in the Mexican Revolution, or my great-grandfather who came here fleeing from Ukraine in the midst of Russian aggression 100 years ago. This is what's made us an incredible city, a strong city, a diverse city, and a city poised to help the world. So I established an Office of Immigrant Affairs for the first time. Even though immigration is usually seen as a national issue, I said, how can we not do that here? In the early 20th century, New York took immigrants that were coming predominantly from Europe, but other places too, from Italy and Ireland and other places. They taught them citizenship and English, and it was something the city did. And I think cities need to do that again. And I'm proud to be part of a network of dozens of cities that now have either representatives or offices of immigrant affairs. So you stand up at moments like when you saw a Muslim ban going to LAX and welcoming, an Iranian immigrant who was Muslim who came, who probably the president at the time didn't want to have here, and to show the face of America and LA embracing him. But also then following up when people need to have their immigration status taken care of, or as we've done, raise money to pay for just the application fees for community college students to legalize their status. And I've hired people who too were undocumented, who have worked for us here and been able to, show that they are Angelenos, that they are Americans, that they just need a government and a policy that will integrate them. And it's one of the saddest things to see even now with, I know, a razor thin majority in both Houses of Congress, that Democrats were still not able to execute the immigration reform that, by the way, many Republicans are for, that President Trump promised he'd do with Dreamers. And that when President Biden is saying we'll get rid of even the pandemic rules that exclude people from coming in, we're not sure if the Senate can even get it through because of some more conservative senators. So we have to keep this fight going. But I think the local level is the place where we can integrate. We can say, people are going to be here no matter what laws you make, and we're going to make sure that they know that they belong here.
Great, thank you. And continuing with questions from the audience, but at the same time, questions that we also had in terms of bringing in local action, as you're mentioning. And a question in particular, how has the city addressed homelessness during your tenure and the actions that you will take before leaving in December? And to add one section from also the audience, the question is particular about the action plan. What is the action plan?
So, it's when I came here, I've worked on homelessness since I was 14, volunteering in Skid Row. And when I was a student, I went to college in New York. That was probably the main issue I worked on. So for me, and I'll work on it long after I'm mayor. I think a lot of politicians avoid homelessness because it's so difficult to solve. And usually you don't have the power to solve it. Cities, which a lot of people don't realize, if homelessness is the combination of trauma and high rent, don't really control either of those things. We don't have a mental health department, a veterans affairs. We don't control the child welfare system, which creates a lot of homelessness. We don't have the criminal justice system with prisons and reentry and criminal justice forms. All we have are police and sanitation workers, and you cannot arrest or clean your way out of homelessness, no matter how badly people want that. We have to go deeper and look at the core issues. So since I became mayor, we've put together a strategic plan. Since I became mayor, we've gone from $10 million to $1 billion of a city budget that's only about 10 billion. And everything was spoken for. In other words, we can't shut down libraries or not have our parks, but we've gone from about 10 million to $1 billion a year. And my budget, which will come out shortly, will be about that too. We got the largest measure ever passed for housing. in American history, which will produce and help leverage about 12,000 permanent units of affordable housing, mostly for folks who have been formerly homeless or preventing people from becoming homeless. We passed a countywide measure for services. So when I boil it down, we need more housing, we need more shelter, and we need more services. But we'll never end homelessness in America if we think our cities are the ones who are going to solve it. Until we have universal mental health care and acknowledge a lot of the trauma that people carry, and until we have a right to housing in this country. In other words, think about it. With food, if somebody is hungry in this country and doesn't have any money, it doesn't matter how many Americans are hungry. Food stamps goes to everybody that qualifies. It's an entitlement program. Think about healthcare. If you're indigent and have no healthcare, Medicaid, which we call Medi-Cal here in California, goes to every American that needs it. But if you need housing, which is equally as important as eating, shelter is as important as eating, and your healthcare. You know the statistic? 1 out of 4 Americans who qualifies for a voucher for housing gets it. And in Los Angeles, it's 1 out of 8. So 7 out of 8 aren't all unhoused, but many of them are. And imagine if we had a right to housing. Every country that's ended homelessness has said, if you're on the streets, we will house you first and then treat the trauma that you carry. We're trying to still treat the trauma that you carry on the streets with not enough money. But we've gone from 12 outreach workers to 150. We've gone from the 10 million to $1 billion. I'm actually quite optimistic that we will see homelessness begin to come down the next couple of years, but it will not end until we have a right to housing and mental health care in this country.
Continuing along the lines of housing in particular, and I would like to encourage also the audience to keep sending in their comments in the chat, and the previous question also thanks to Paige Brogan also for bringing it up. But for us, ourselves as Oxy students, we in our neighborhood, Eagle Rock and Highland Park, we see the visible effects of gentrification. And connecting to this question of the right to housing that you just asked, what models has the city explored in terms of combating the negative impacts of gentrification?
Many things. I mean, from our rent stabilization ordinance, which is a model in the country to ensure that people can't just have anything that's built before 1979, which is the great majority of our housing. You can't raise the rent beyond what the city authorizes, which is usually 2 or 3% a year, or as it was during the pandemic, nothing, because of obviously people's housing insecurity. We've put about $500 million. That's right. You heard that right. $500 million of rent and utility assistance forward in the last 2 years to keep people housed. And I think one of the great stories of the pandemic is really how few people will have lost their housing because they lost their job. It was close to anywhere between 3/4 and 80% of people, I think, were able to access that and use that. But we also have to look at building more housing. And I know that's controversial. Sometimes people fall on one side or the other. Just protect people who exist in the housing that they're in, and that is critical. But if we also don't simultaneously build more housing, we will never get ahead of the 40-year gap in housing. That's why rents are so high. So since I've been mayor, I've been very proud to have done a couple of things. We've tripled the number of housing units being built each year. And the number that were affordable used to only be 6%. Now it's 25%. Like I'd love for it to be 80 or 90%, but the market builds most of the housing. But we've leveraged the market saying, if you want to build market rate housing, you now have to pay either a linkage fee, build affordable units inside, or on your own dime, if you want to go taller, build low-income housing units, which has increased by 600% the number of housing units for folks who are coming out of homelessness and very low income. But if you ask me, we need to double that again. We need to build approximately 450,000 units of housing in the next decade in LA County. That's like taking all the housing in the San Fernando Valley and putting it in LA County. In LA City alone, 250,000 units. Now, we won't get to 250,000 units. There's just not enough money, space, and will. But we have to get as close to 250,000 as we can. We have to keep insisting that those folks pay money so that we can have money on this side to subsidize the building of more lower income, lower rent housing that can work for the middle class, the working class, and for those who are unhoused. I think that's the greatest way to address gentrification in any neighborhood.
Thank you. I will ask 2 more questions that we have from the audience, again, encouraging participation in the chat. I'm from Barbara Haley. We're rating again. I'm so happy to hear reduction of the traffic is a goal in the city of Los Angeles. How will that happen?
So traffic is probably the one where we all pull our hair out the most and the toughest thing. I came in, it's interesting as I look back, I'm at the end of my time as mayor and people say, well, why didn't you solve X, Y, and Z? And I kind of knew 9 years ago that the things I'd be doing now would pay off probably the decade or two after I were mayor if I did them right. I talk about something to my team called the backwards looking future self. In other words, don't be worried about the criticisms of today or the headlines of tomorrow. Imagine you are you 10 years from now. You don't have the pressure of this moment. Looking back on the decision you're making today, and was it the right decision? Were you glad you made that decision? Because it was Mayor Bloomberg who actually told me once, the things that he was least popular for are the things now that people are happiest he did. You know, so it's not winning popularity contests all the time. It's about getting things done. So when it came to traffic, I said, look, we'd never had public transportation at the airport. Our airport was falling apart. We don't have public transit in enough neighborhoods. What can I do to build a county-wide coalition? Because the city of LA is the biggest city, but it's only 40% of the county population, and there's 87 other cities. So for the first time, and traditionally everybody loves to hate or resent the mayor of the city of LA because supervisors say, hey, we've got more people than you. All these other cities say you get 90% of the headlines, but you're only 40% of the population. So I thought to myself, what can I do to show a better face from the mayor's office here in LA? So I started convening all the other 87 mayors with me every quarter, 4 times a year. We'd go to Long Beach, or we'd go to South El Monte, or we'd go up to Santa Clarita, or we'd go to other cities to talk about things in common. How we could win the Olympics and Paralympics together. How do we do earthquake safety? What can we do about homelessness? How can we address climate change? And through that, I was able to put on the ballot Measure M, which was the most ambitious and largest transportation measure at the local level in US history ×2. It was interesting. We thought it would be maybe a 10 or 20 year sales tax. But when we did polling, because you need 2/3 to pass a tax, the longer we said it lasted, the better it did, which I had never seen in politics before. And I think it was that people didn't want this to go away because they knew traffic was going to be a long-term problem. They wanted their children and children's children to have money to address it. So we proposed it as a permanent 1-cent tax, and it passed with 73%. That's 15 rapid transit lines. 15. Some of them are extensions, but most of them are new. That's never been done in American history, at least not recent history. Maybe New York when they built out their subway system. But it finally gives us a shot to see public transportation system that will work for folks, even as we improve today's. Second, technology. I think technology is going to play a huge role in traffic, whether it's more interconnected cars that can talk to each other and build capacity, whether it's autonomous vehicles, whether it's even some of the air taxis that we're talking about and that are ready for prime time, certainly by the time the Olympics come here. There's going to be a lot of technological, I think, innovation that will help us create a smoother, transit for people going from point to point. But the third, and maybe the most important, more important even than the infrastructure or the technology, is planning good communities. LA was built on the car model, which was very innovative, by the way, in its time. It was very cutting edge in the 1950s. It was better than the public transit systems, which is why we did it. But now there's no more room for it. Not everybody can afford a car and we're stuck in traffic. We need communities where the housing isn't over here and the jobs over there, and where we put the stores over here and the fun over here. We need a great boulevards plan where we see streets like Beverly or Melrose or Ventura. Why don't we have housing above the stores and the restaurants right there so that people can come home on transit or in their cars and then walk and shop and dine and eat and maybe even work right there? So we're revising our city's plans to do that. And we're also adding to that the ability to build more housing along our transit corridors. So wherever we're putting those 15 lines, we're saying you can go much higher. You have to build affordable housing so we don't push people out who are at risk already of losing their housing. And to me, that'll be the greatest reducer of traffic. I hate saying be patient, but we're all going to have to be patient. This will take a decade to build out some of the lines. But good news, the downtown connector, which lets you go from Long Beach to Azusa without changing your seat, from East LA to Santa Monica without changing your seat, is now done, and we're testing the trains. It should open in the fall. And the Crenshaw LAX line is now done, and we're testing it. Should also open up the fall. That'll finally get us to LAX and have a great line down the center of South Los Angeles. More coming in the Valley, a BRT that will go right past Occidental College, which we're voting on this month. That'll take you from North Hollywood to Pasadena and back. So I think great things are happening on those fronts, and you'll see some of it. Be patient for the long term, but I promise you in the next 4 or 5 years, you'll see a number of lines open that should be a good relief.
Thank you for the explanation. We have one more question coming from Margaret saying he's a veteran. He's furious at how the West Valley is being overrun by elite factions. And the question is, what can you do?
By what?
It's been overrun by elite factions.
Okay.
The West Valley in particular. What can you do to make sure that this location remains dedicated for veterans?
Oh, so the Veterans Administration maybe is what you're talking about in the Valley. There's West LA. Maybe it's West LA he's talking about. The West LA veterans, I couldn't agree with more. And there's also a facility out in the North Valley. So it could be either one of those. And I'll answer it because it applies to both. I'm a veteran as well. I established an Office of Veterans Affairs for the first time in the city's history. And it was really important to me. I took the pledge on ending veterans homelessness that Michelle Obama put forward, even though we had the most in the country. And we've been able in the city of LA to reduce that by 85%, even though there's still thousands in the county. But when we looked at the land that West LA has, and it was dedicated post-Civil War to veterans, it is absolutely appalling that I think the elite factions, when you're talking about whether it's private schools or UCLA, or that they converted it to essentially just being a veterans medical center, which is very important. All of us vets need that. But we've got land right next to where people literally were homeless on the streets. So I've been part of that fight to get us in there and to build housing. We're finally in there, from shelter to housing to safe camping, which is now inside the fence so that people can be safe. But I would advise, and I talked to this Secretary of Veterans Affairs, who's been a really good partner in the Biden administration, Secretary McDonough, and he helped get those people in a safe place. Let's convert the whole mission of that place and the space of that place and the funding from the government, not relying on us to find the funds, to build housing for every single unhoused veteran in LA County. It can be achieved. It's a matter of will at the federal level of our Congress and of the administration. And we can look back and say that LA, the most expensive, densely populated place in America, arguably, figured out a way with this land that was meant for veterans to erase that ugly chapter of decades of neglect. So count on me to continue in my private capacity post-mayor, and right now, every last day that I'm mayor, to put that CNN piece was one of the best pieces of journalism that I've seen, you might be referring to, that talked about everybody else is nibbled on this campus, but then there's homeless veterans that are literally outside the gates. That is wrong.
We'll pass it now to Caroline to continue with our questions.
Thank you. In the wake of summer 2020 BLM protests, students at Occidental College worked on outlining a truth and accountability process regarding racial injustice in Los Angeles. What are your thoughts on the applicability of this type of global model within the specific context of LA?
I love it, Caroline. And it's something that I actually taught when I was at Occidental, comparing different truth and reconciliation from those countries that, like Rwanda, that put people in prison, to ones like South Africa in between that issued a report, but then for a kind of gave amnesty to people as long as they took responsibility for their actions, to places in West Africa, like I think it was Liberia or Sierra Leone, that just said, blanket forgiveness, let's move on, and didn't even want to deal with it. So there's all sorts of different models. To me, you have to face the truth if you want to move on. And so before the racial justice marches, I had started with a former Occidental linked professor who's now our chief design officer for the city of LA, Christopher Hawthorne, LA's first kind of truth and reconciliation program, essentially, a historical memory program. For instance, so few people know that LA is arguably the site of the largest mass lynching in American history, when Angelenos of Chinese descent were lynched a block from where I'm speaking right now, in a misunderstanding, a shootout that happened from some criminals who shot at a then kind of police officer, and the Latino and white citizens of LA went after every Chinese person they could find, killed them and lynched them. And now we're going to be building more than just a little, but an understanding of that so we can move forward and integrate at a time when AAPI hate incidents are up. This has resonance right now. When we look at, for instance, the work that needs to be done, some of the work policing and accountability, whether it is the work to put body cameras, de-escalation, implicit bias training that's helped bring LA's deaths, fatal police shootings from somewhere in the top third to 96th out of 100 per capita just in the last 8 years. That's real work that is that we have to keep pushing on and that we can share with others. So I think when we look at racial justice, we have to look at the numbers and propose real concrete things. I mean, we have to be able to, for instance, look at the fact that Mexican origin and Black families in LA have not 1/10 the wealth as we see nationally, but 1/100th the wealth of white families. And so I've led a Mayors for Reparations movement in this country, and we're working on helping support the federal move, and now at Sacramento too, to look at reparations. We're looking at that with our native populations. We're looking at, and we gave back at this birthplace of our city, where El Pueblo, Olvera Street is, we gave back a cultural easement to the Tongva who once lived there, saying, you have the first call on the use of this land now, always, even though they're not federally recognized. We figured out a way to do that. So I think across the city, across our geography, up in Eagle Rock, we looked at, imagine what Eagle Rock itself was once, and could that be something that could be given to a nonprofit that is really the native peoples that were here, or out in Chatsworth, we're looking at the same. So I think we have to look at the wrongs that have been visited on people because of their history, because of their color, because of racism, because of redlining, and integrate it into our DNA. And the last thing I'll say is Brenda Shockley was quickly introduced, but she's the first chief equity officer in the history of the city of Los Angeles, not just a deputy mayor, but a position charged that every department has to now have also an equity officer. So it's not just something for the library to think about historically. It's the police department, the DWP, the Port of Los Angeles. We're looking at equity so that we're not just writing what's wrong in the past, but we're figuring out a way to make sure this is baked into the DNA of the future. For instance, commissioners who serve the city of LA. These are volunteers who oversee these very powerful departments. They've never been 50% women. So in my first 2 years, we made it more than 50% women for the first time. Our DWP board is all women. I mean, nobody ever batted an eye in the past when it was all men, but all of a sudden people are like, whoa, all women, isn't that too many? Like, no, actually it's the right thing. When we looked at our sports programs, 25% of the participants in our park sports programs and rec centers were girls. So we started Girls Play LA, and without taking a single spot away from a boy, we raised girls' participation up from 25% to 40 to 45% to 50%. So I think that, as we look at truth reconciliation, we have to acknowledge the past, but don't let it just be a backwards looking exercise. It has to be about action today.
Thank you very much. In continuation of global and local, or Professor Chase.
I just wanted to insert really quickly. It's a wonderful conversation, but probably we're ending near the end. So maybe one, possibly two more questions, and then we'll move on.
Okay, so then shifting a bit, as you come to the end of your mayoral term, what projects or initiatives have given you a sense of completeness and pride?
Well, if you're doing your job right, as I said, you probably aren't completing things. I get the baton from somebody and I'm handing it off because it's our collective work. It's not a mayor's work. We fixate so much on, I've been asked this question so much, what's your legacy? I don't care about my legacy. I hope the only legacy that people will understand is that I love this city and that I worked my tail off for 2 decades to try to make it better. That's all I care. In terms of the work, we have to co-own it. We can't expect it to be, homelessness is not a one-click problem. We're used to things happening so quickly. We go on Amazon, we have it the next day or even a couple hours later, and we're not used to digging in on the hard work. I hope that running to the fire of homelessness is part of what we're leaving behind, that nobody can back off that or say, it's not my responsibility. But certainly our Green New Deal, which I think is a model for this world, as well as this country, that will get us past this drought, that'll get us to 100, the 5 zeros of zero carbon buildings, zero carbon transportation, zero carbon electricity, zero waste, and zero wasted water. That is a powerful legacy. Even just the water recycling that we're going to do of the plant south of LAX, where about 60% of our wastewater goes, that's the equivalent of 3 LA aqueducts. That bubbling stream that comes down in the North Valley that William Mulholland built to steal water from Owens Valley. And by the way, we made peace with Owens Valley for the first time in 100 years. I went up there a few times and said, we will finally give some of your water back and we will be better stewards of it. That Green New Deal is a real model. I think the racial justice work has to continue. I hope to whatever deity you worship, for me, it's God, that we do not have a stepping away from the momentum of 2 years ago. And it was very sad to see a lot of that work not get done at the national level, but that doesn't mean we can't keep pushing it forward here. The largest guaranteed basic income program, which we're launching to hopefully inspire Washington to go back to what it had just done, even with the child tax credit, which eliminated 40 or 60% of child poverty in America, but now it's gone. Come on, let's get it back there. And then the infrastructure. I mean, in the simplest terms, I tried to get the city back to basics, pave more streets, answer the calls more quickly, do those small things that matter, because that's really what running a city is about. But I also looked at trying to build the city of tomorrow, a more equitable city and a city with a better infrastructure, because we had ignored our housing, our public transportation, our airport and port for far too long. So that's what I focused on. But every day, by the way, is when people ask what it's like to be mayor. Probably somebody comes up and says, I love you. Somebody comes up and says, I hate you. Somebody is grateful for something you've done on their street, in their neighborhood. But I have to say, people are so much kinder in person than we see sometimes in the kind of realm of social media or activism. I think human beings are sick of the kind of narcissism of like, let's stick it to whoever our leaders are, because one day you may be that leader. And you have to understand leadership is about, yes, I was a big person, led student protests, a big activist. The street always has its place. We need that. But you also have to learn how to cross the street and come indoors and negotiate. And right now in America, whether you're conservative or progressive, if we don't get 100% of what we want, we get so upset. We might find somebody who gives us 90% and we'll yell at them about that 10% we didn't get. When you're a mayor, you're happy with 5%. If I can get you 5% better today, I can wake up and get 5% more tomorrow and 5% the next day until we've built justice and built a legacy for everybody. I can take a couple more. Don't worry, I've got a couple more minutes.
Thank you. I'll pass it over to Alejo.
Thanks, Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you for the flexibility. We have a question particular to climate. Again, going back to the topic of climate. You have adopted a commendable goal, says Peter Vorster, to climate-proof LA's water supply by significantly reducing the city's reliance on imported water supply. Does this goal include further reductions in imported freshwater supplies from the Mono Lake watershed, since the unique lake is still 12 feet below what is mandated ecologically healthy level and generates the highest levels of particular air quality pollution in the country due to the exposed lake bottom?
So it's Owens Lake that has the highest at the bottom, which is a dry lake bed that has the worst large particulate pollution in the country. And yes, what I referred to is for the first time in 100 years, we made peace with, instead of dumping a lot of water on that lake bed that wasn't used by the locals at all, and we couldn't use either, we figured out a different way to mitigate that dust by building essentially big dunes and stopping the wind from blowing that, and then giving more water back, yes, to that watershed. So Mono Lake, which is up at the top, will benefit from that because we'll have to take less. And then the long-term plan that I have that is part of the Green New Deal, today only 15%, just 15% of our water is local. We're going to get to 70%. It's going to take billions of dollars of building this out. But when I talked about Hyperion, that plant, we already recycle some of our water, use it for our parks and other things, but we're going to bring it back to a drinkable standard. 60% of all of our daily water goes there, gets cleaned up to an almost drinkable standard, and then washed out to the ocean. The last place that actually needs more water, it needs less. The ocean's rising and we're drying on land. So how do we bring that back? And I think it will make us drought proof. I'm not scared at all. As long as the next mayor and the next mayor after that finishes this plan that we've put in place, we will have plenty of water to accommodate the growth here and to restore the ecology in the Owens Valley and around the Southland.
Thank you. For another question from Paige Brogan is asking on leadership in terms of global diplomacy. So how should citizens of Los Angeles show up as leaders in our individual communities?
I'll take that as the last question because that's what I loved about being a teacher and that I miss. Although I've had such extraordinary students who have worked, whether it's at Occidental or the Mayor's Youth Council. I have a Mayor's Youth Advisory Council on gun violence and on climate change as well. I would say a couple things. One is, especially for those DWA students, don't just go global first. I'm really glad in many ways. I did some global things. I worked with the Democratic Resistance in Burma right after college. I lived in Ethiopia and Eritrea when I was doing my graduate work and helped stand up some women's development groups that were there. I'm really glad I had those experiences. So see the world, but then come back to a local community. Come back to a local community that you're a part of. Don't fixate if you want to go into national politics. Oh, I need an internship on the Hill. Or I want to go off and work for the UN. I would say Start someplace where you're connected to people over a medium period of time. You're helping them with food security in a food desert in an American city, or it doesn't matter if it's abroad, if that's where you want to stay and live, where you're working on gender equity in a village in Ethiopia, and you stay there for a long period of time. You need to put down roots if you're going to be an activist. It's so easy to be a Twitter activist. It's so easy to take the selfie in front of the whatever. And those places, like I said, it's necessary to always have the mass movements. What's much more difficult is the relational work of bringing people together across opinions and geography and ideologies and races and cultures. We have to figure out a way to lay those roots down. And I'll tell you, my most powerful moments as mayor is not when I'm talking about a Green New Deal, but I'm sharing the story of somebody who lives next to an oil well, whose parents had cancer because of that. You know, in other words, it is the specific story that leads us to, I think, the greatest emotion and then the greatest action that comes from it. It's not going top down. It's from the bottom up. Every activist in the 60s who made change in this country, I think, had a plan not only to alert the national leaders of where they wanted to go, but to build the power from the base up and to, by the way, accommodate the difference of opinions at that base and to figure out the way to move that forward. So be an activist local, find something that moves you, and don't think that you're not powerful. Tomorrow's most powerful leader is the person who today is starting a conversation by knocking on the door of a neighbor.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks so much. A great last question, a great last answer. Really appreciated that. And just want to thank Caroline and Alejo again for doing such a great job as ever in terms of leading that conversation with the mayor. Want to thank everyone who joined us today. And before signing off, I just have to add, and a special thanks to our closest partners in city government who've been carrying out much of what the mayor has described today. Aaron Bromajan, Angela Kim, and I'd love to add Zita Davis to that, with whom we're also increasingly working. Aaron and Angela and Zita, I think you know this, Mr. Mayor, are dedicated, whip smart, and so open to innovation. They just make perfect partners to give many, many Occidental students the chance to work on some remarkable projects that have had real impacts in the ways that you've described. And at Occidental, we like to think of ourselves as being in real partnership with the city of LA, with all of LA's many communities. And I think these joint projects have really embodied that. So with that, a final thanks to the mayor. LA was a globalized city well before you were mayor, but it's powerful and it's important that you have embraced that transnational diversity of our city and proudly put that front and center in terms of the story we tell of who we are. So thanks to you for that. Thanks for sharing your time today and your thoughts and your service. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much. Thanks again to Alejo and Caroline. Thanks, President. Take care. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.